the 17th of January 1942, New Orleans, Louisiana. The air along the industrial canal hung thick with humidity and the acrid smell of welded steel. Dawn had barely broken, and already the heat pressed down on the shipyard like a physical weight. Inside a cavernous warehouse on the edge of the Mississippi River, sparks cascaded from acetylene torches in brilliant orange showers, illuminating the skeletal frames of boats that looked nothing like the warships being hammered together in Brooklyn or San Francisco. These were smaller, flat-bottomed, ugly things, 36 feet of plywood and steel that seemed more suited to hauling lumber across a bayou than carrying men into battle. A short, stocky man in oil-stained coveralls moved between the welders with the restless energy of someone who had never learned to stand still. Andrew Jackson Higgins, 61 years old, silver-haired, profane, paused beside an unfinished hull and ran his calloused hand along the ramp mechanism at the bow. The metallic clang of hammers echoed through the warehouse. Outside, the war was 9 weeks old. Inside, Higgins was building something the United States Navy insisted it did not need. But he knew better. The sound that defined that morning was not the crack of gunfire or the roar of engines. It was the rhythmic pounding of rivets driven into steel, each one a small defiance, each one a bet that war would not wait for bureaucracy to catch up. By the winter of 1942, the United States military faced a problem it had never truly solved: how to move men from ship to shore under fire. Not slowly, not in stages, not with the luxury of a port, but directly across open water, onto hostile beaches, through surf and sand, and the killing fields of enemy machine guns. The concept was not new. Amphibious warfare had existed in theory for centuries. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 had demonstrated its necessity. But that same campaign, 25,000 Allied dead in the first months alone, had also demonstrated its horror. Ships anchored offshore, rowboats ferrying men toward the beach, soldiers forced to leap into chest-deep water, while Turkish rifles found them like fish in a barrel. The British had learned the lesson too well. Amphibious assault was suicide unless you controlled the landing. And in 1942, America controlled nothing. The Marine Corps understood this better than anyone. Since the 1922nd, a small cadre of officers had been quietly developing amphibious doctrine, writing theoretical manuals about how to seize fortified islands in the Pacific. They imagined landing craft that could drive straight onto a beach, drop a ramp, and disgorge troops without stopping. They envisioned armored tractors that could crawl over coral reefs and through surf zones where conventional boats would flounder. They saw the future of war, but they did not have the tools to fight it. The Navy, for its part, remained skeptical. Admirals still thought in terms of battleships and cruisers, the great grey fortresses of steel that had dominated naval warfare since the age of Mahan. Amphibious operations seemed messy, improvised, almost beneath the dignity of a proper fleet. The few landing craft that existed in the American arsenal were clumsy, slow, and fundamentally flawed. Most were based on British designs, open boats with square bows that could not retract. Troops had to clamber over the sides, exposed and vulnerable, wading the final yards through surf while enemy fire tore into them. It was not a landing. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. And so, in the opening months of the war, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, the United States faced a grim calculus. Without the ability to project force onto enemy shores, there could be no offensive. Without an offensive, there could be no victory. And without victory, the world would belong to fascism. The clock was ticking, and America did not have amphibious tractors. It barely had boats. Andrew Higgins had never cared much for what the Navy thought. He was a boat builder, not a bureaucrat, and he had built his reputation in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, where the rivers ran shallow and the oil companies needed something that could navigate waters too treacherous for conventional craft. His boats were ugly and utilitarian, flat-bottomed, shallow draft, with tunnel-protected propellers that could plough through sandbars and stumps without fouling. They were designed to go where other boats could not, to operate in hostile environments, to keep moving when the water got rough. In 1938, the Marine Corps had come looking. They had heard rumors of a Louisiana boat builder who could put a craft onto a beach and back it off again without grounding. They wanted to see it for themselves. Higgins had obliged. He had taken one of his swamp boats, redesigned with a reinforced bow, and driven it straight onto a sandbar in Lake Pontchartrain. Then he had reversed the engines and pulled it off again, clean and simple, as if the laws of physics were negotiable. The Marines were impressed. The Navy was not. There were committees, there were tests. There were objections about hull design and displacement ratios, and 1,000 other technicalities that Higgins had no patience for. He had built boats that worked. The Navy wanted boats that conformed to regulations. But Higgins was stubborn. He kept building. He kept refining. And when the war began, when the need became undeniable, the Navy finally came back. They wanted something that could carry 36 men, something that could approach a beach at full speed, drop a ramp, and unload in seconds. Something cheap enough to mass-produce and simple enough to operate under fire. They wanted it fast, and they wanted it to work. Higgins called it the LCVP Landing Craft Vehicle, personnel. History would call it the Higgins boat. The engineers who worked in Higgins's shipyard understood the stakes, even if they did not speak of them openly. This was not about profit margins or production quotas. This was about the boy from Ohio who would step off that ramp onto Omaha Beach. This was about the Marine from Iowa who would wade through the surf at Tarawa. Every weld had to hold. Every rivet had to be flush. Every ramp mechanism had to drop smoothly, because hesitation measured in seconds could mean the difference between life and death. The design was deceptively simple. 36 feet long, 10 feet wide, with a flat bottom that drew less than 3 feet of water. The hull was plywood over a wooden frame, reinforced with steel plates at the bow. A single diesel engine mounted at the rear could push the boat to 9 knots, not fast, but fast enough. The bow itself was a marvel of functional engineering, a steel ramp that could be lowered in seconds, forming a gangway wide enough for 3 men to charge abreast. When the ramp was up, it served as armor, protecting the troops crouched inside from enemy fire. But the genius of the design was not in any single feature. It was in how the features worked together. The shallow draft meant the boat could navigate reefs and sandbars that would ground conventional landing craft. The tunnel-protected propeller meant it could reverse off a beach without fouling in sand or debris. The plywood construction meant it could be built quickly and cheaply by shipyards that had never manufactured military vessels. And the ramp, that simple, hinged steel ramp, meant that soldiers could charge forward instead of climbing sideways, that they could hit the beach moving instead of stumbling, that they could carry the momentum of the assault onto the shore. In the sterile language of military logistics, the LCVP solved a tactical problem. In the brutal reality of combat, it saved lives. The Germans, in those early years of the war, did not think much about amphibious assault. Why would they? Their strategy was predicated on land power blitzkrieg across the plains of Poland and France, mechanized columns smashing through enemy lines faster than defenders could react. The sea was a barrier, yes, but one that could be controlled by submarines and naval mines. The idea that an enemy might mount a large-scale amphibious invasion seemed remote, almost theoretical. But the German General Staff was not stupid. They studied history. They had read the reports from Gallipoli. They knew that amphibious landings were costly, chaotic, and vulnerable. If the Allies ever attempted to invade occupied Europe, the Germans believed they could stop them at the waterline. Machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, artillery pre-sighted on the tidal flats. Let the enemy come ashore in rowboats. Let them wade through the surf while Mauser fire cut them down. The Atlantic Wall would be the graveyard of Allied ambition. What the Germans did not anticipate was that the Americans would refuse to play by the old rules, that instead of rowing ashore, they would drive, that instead of climbing out of boats, they would charge off ramps, that instead of 1 or 2 landing craft, there would be hundreds, then thousands, all descending on a beach at once, in a coordinated wave of steel and firepower and human will. The Higgins boat changed the mathematics of amphibious warfare. It turned landing operations from a desperate gamble into a calculated risk, from a last resort into a viable offensive strategy. And in doing so, it shifted the entire trajectory of the war. The first major test came not in Europe but in the Pacific. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The Marines went ashore in the pre-dawn darkness, riding waves of Higgins boats toward the beaches of a jungle-covered island that most Americans had never heard of. The boats hit the sand with a grinding crunch. The ramps dropped, and the Marines poured out not into waist-deep water under fire, but straight onto the beach, weapons ready, formations intact. The Japanese were caught off guard. They had expected a slow, cautious approach, the kind of tentative landing that would give defenders time to marshal their forces. Instead, the Marines were already inland before the full weight of Japanese resistance could be organized. The speed of the assault, the sheer volume of men and material delivered directly onto the shore, overwhelmed the initial defenses. It was not an easy victory. Guadalcanal would become a 6-month nightmare of jungle fighting, supply shortages, and relentless Japanese counterattacks. But the landing itself, the ability to put 10,000 Marines onto a hostile shore in the span of a few hours, proved the concept. The Higgins boat worked, and the orders began to flood in. By 1943, Higgins Industries was producing boats at a rate that seemed almost incomprehensible. 20,000 workers, most of them women, operated around the clock in 7 shipyards scattered across New Orleans. Plywood panels were pre-cut and assembled like pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle. Steel ramps were forged in blast furnaces and hauled to the assembly lines while still warm. Engines arrived by rail from Detroit and were bolted into place within hours of delivery. The entire production process, from raw materials to finished craft, took less than a week. At peak capacity, Higgins Industries was launching 1 boat every 6 minutes. The soldiers and Marines who rowed those boats into battle did not think of them as engineering marvels. They thought of them as coffins. 36 men crammed into a plywood box, huddled below the gunwales while the boat bucked and rolled through heavy surf. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with vomit. The roar of the engine made conversation impossible. And always, the knowledge that when that ramp dropped, you would have to stand up and charge forward while the world exploded around you. But they also knew this. The Higgins boat would get them to the beach. It would not strand them in deep water. It would not leave them climbing over the sides of a sinking hull. It would drive straight onto the sand, drop its ramp, and give them a fighting chance. That was more than most of them had expected. For many German soldiers, the first time they truly understood what they were facing came on a grey morning in June 1944, Normandy. The Higgins boats appeared out of the mist like a fleet of rectangular ghosts, hundreds of them moving in disciplined waves toward the beaches. The Germans in their bunkers watched through field glasses and could not comprehend the scale. This was not a landing. This was an invasion, industrial, mechanized, relentless. The machine guns opened fire. Artillery shells began to fall, but the boats kept coming. Some were hit. Some burned. Some floundered in the surf, their crews killed before the ramps could drop. But for every boat that went down, 10 more surged forward. The ramps fell. The men charged out. And within minutes, the beaches were choked with soldiers, not scattered survivors clinging to cover, but organized units moving with purpose, clearing obstacles, suppressing fire, pushing inland. The Germans had prepared for an amphibious assault, but they had not prepared for this. They had not imagined that a single, flat-bottomed boat, built in a Louisiana shipyard by a profane boat builder who had never finished high school, would become the instrument of their undoing. There is a photograph, taken sometime in late 1943, that has survived in the archives of the National World War II Museum. It shows a row of Higgins boats lined up along the industrial canal waiting to be loaded onto transport ships bound for the Pacific. The boats are identical, their bows painted with serial numbers in white stencil. In the background, a woman in coveralls stands on a scaffolding, welding torch in hand, her face obscured by a protective mask. The image is grainy, unremarkable, the kind of thing that would be filed away and forgotten. But that photograph captures something essential about the American war effort, not the grand strategies or the heroic speeches, but the grinding, unglamorous work of mass production. The Higgins boat was not elegant. It was not innovative in the way that radar or the atomic bomb was innovative. It did not represent a leap forward in engineering or physics. It was simply a good idea, executed well, and repeated 10,000 times. And that repetition, that ability to take a functional design and replicate it across an entire industrial base, was something the Axis powers could not match. Germany built better tanks. Japan built better torpedoes. But neither could match the sheer productive capacity of American industry, the ability to churn out weapons and vehicles and landing craft faster than the enemy could destroy them. The Higgins boat became a symbol of that capacity. By the end of the war, more than 20,000 LCVPs had been built. They landed troops on beaches across the Pacific: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They supported the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. They ferried soldiers across the Rhine in the final push into Germany. And when the war ended, when the smoke cleared and the accountants began tallying the costs, General Dwight Eisenhower would call Andrew Higgins the man who won the war for us. It was hyperbole, perhaps, but it was not entirely wrong. Andrew Higgins himself did not live to see the full recognition of his contribution. He died in 1952, his fortune lost to bad business decisions and tax troubles. His shipyards closed and sold off. The war had made him indispensable. Peace made him obsolete. The military no longer needed boats by the thousands. The economy no longer rewarded the kind of frantic, improvised production that had defined the war years. Higgins Industries collapsed, and the man who had built it faded into obscurity. But the boats endured. For decades after the war, LCVPs sat in storage depots and naval yards, their plywood hulls slowly rotting, their engines rusting. Some were sold for scrap, some were refitted for civilian use, hauling cargo along rivers and coasts. A few were preserved in museums, mounted on pedestals with plaques explaining their significance. And a few, very few, were kept in service, maintained by Marine units, who understood that sometimes the old ways are still the best ways. As recently as the 1,982nd, LCVPs were being used in training exercises, ferrying young Marines onto beaches in California and North Carolina, teaching a new generation what it meant to charge off a ramp into the unknown. There is a particular sound that veterans of amphibious landings remember, the metallic clang of the ramp hitting the sand. It was the last sound you heard before the world became chaos, before the bullets started snapping past your head, before the mortar rounds began to fall, before you had to stand up and run forward, because staying in the boat meant death just as surely as going forward did. That sound, metal on sand, the finality of it was the sound of commitment. Once that ramp dropped, there was no going back. You could not retreat to the boat. You could not ask for more time. You were on the beach, and the beach was hell, and the only way out was forward. But there was something else in that sound, something the enemy did not hear. It was the sound of possibility, of mobility, of an industrial democracy that could build tens of thousands of boats and fill them with millions of men and send them across oceans to fight for something they believed in, or at least something they had been told was worth fighting for. The Germans in their bunkers, the Japanese in their pillboxes, they heard that sound and understood, in some inarticulate way, that they were facing something they could not defeat. Not because American soldiers were braver or better trained, but because America could simply outproduce them. For every boat destroyed, another would take its place. For every landing repulsed, another would be launched. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace its losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The Higgins boat was the physical manifestation of that advantage. Cheap, simple, replaceable, and utterly relentless. In the years after the war, military historians would analyze the factors that led to Allied victory. They would point to superior strategy, to code breaking, to the atomic bomb, to Soviet manpower and British resilience. All of these were true. But beneath them, supporting them, making them possible, was a foundation of logistics and production that allowed the Allies to sustain a war effort across multiple continents for years. And at the very base of that foundation, carrying men from ship to shore, was a 36-foot plywood boat, built by a man who had learned his trade in the swamps of Louisiana. There is a tendency, in the retelling of history, to focus on the great leaders and the pivotal battles, to reduce complex events to simple narratives of heroism and sacrifice. And those narratives are not wrong. There were heroes, there were sacrifices, but there were also shipyards and assembly lines and anonymous workers welding steel at 3 a.m. because the quota had to be met and the war would not wait. The LCVP was built by people whose names we do not know. It was crewed by sailors who never received medals. It carried soldiers who died on beaches we have half forgotten. And yet it changed the course of history as surely as any tank or bomber or aircraft carrier. By 1945, the strategic situation had shifted so completely that it was difficult to remember how tenuous things had seemed just 3 years earlier. The Allies controlled the seas. They controlled the skies. They could strike anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. Amphibious operations had become routine, no longer desperate gambles, but standard procedure, executed with the precision of a well-rehearsed drill. But for the men who had been there at the beginning, who had gone ashore at Guadalcanal or Tarawa when the doctrine was still being written, when every landing was an experiment and every beach was a proving ground, the transformation was almost surreal. They remembered when the mere act of getting onto a hostile shore seemed impossible. They remembered boats that grounded too far out, soldiers drowning in the surf, plans collapsing into chaos within minutes of hour. And they remembered the first time they rowed a Higgins boat onto a beach, the shock of solid sand beneath their feet, the ramp dropping smooth and fast, the realization that they were not wading, not climbing, but running. That small advantage, that single innovation, had saved their lives. It is difficult to quantify how many men owed their survival to the Higgins boat. Thousands, certainly. Tens of thousands, probably. But numbers alone do not capture the significance. Because every man who made it off that boat alive carried the war forward. Every landing that succeeded brought the end of the conflict one step closer. And every beach that was taken, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, represented not just a tactical victory, but a vindication of the idea that democracies could organize, could innovate, could outproduce tyranny. The symbolic weight of the Higgins boat lies not in its complexity but in its simplicity. It was not a wonder weapon. It did not win battles through technological superiority. It won by doing one thing well. It put men on beaches. That was all it had to do. That was enough. In a war defined by mechanization and mass destruction, by bombers that could level cities and submarines that could sink fleets, the LCVP was almost quaint, a plywood box with a ramp. But that simplicity was its strength. It could be built anywhere, by anyone, with materials that were not in short supply. It could be repaired in the field with basic tools. It could operate in conditions that would destroy more sophisticated craft. It was the ultimate expression of American pragmatism, not the best solution, but a good enough solution, available in overwhelming quantities. And in war, overwhelming quantity has a quality all its own. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess, never developed an equivalent. Their landing craft were heavier, slower, less versatile. The Japanese relied on barges and improvised rafts, adequate for short-range operations but useless for sustained amphibious campaigns. Only the Americans and British, drawing on Higgins's designs, possessed the means to project power across oceans and onto hostile shores with the speed and scale necessary to win a global war. There is a rusted Higgins boat displayed at a museum in New Orleans, not far from the shipyard where it was built. The plywood is warped and peeling, the steel ramp corroded by decades of exposure. A small placard explains its history, its specifications, its role in the war. Visitors walk past it, glance at the placard, take a photo, and move on. But sometimes, if you stand there long enough, if you let the noise of the museum fade into the background, you can almost hear it. The roar of the diesel engine, the crash of waves against the hull, the metallic clang of the ramp hitting the sand. And for just a moment, you can imagine what it was like crouched in the belly of that boat. The shore ahead invisible in the spray, the sound of gunfire growing louder, the knowledge that in seconds the ramp would drop and you would have to go forward, because forward was the only direction left. That moment suspended between the boat and the beach, between safety and chaos, was where the war was won. Not in the grand strategies or the diplomatic conferences, but in the hearts of men who stood up when the ramp fell and ran toward the sound of the guns. And they could only do that because Andrew Higgins, a stubborn boat builder from Louisiana, had given them a way to reach the shore. The legacy of the Higgins boat extends beyond the Second World War. Its design principles influenced post-war amphibious craft, from the larger LSTs to the modern hovercraft and amphibious assault vehicles used by Marines today. The idea that a landing craft could drive onto a beach, unload, and reverse off again became the foundational concept for all subsequent amphibious operations. Every Marine who has stormed a beach in the 70 years since Normandy has benefited from the lessons learned in Higgins's shipyards. But the deeper legacy is harder to measure. It lies in the proof that industrial democracies, for all their inefficiencies and bureaucratic tangles, can mobilize in ways that authoritarian regimes cannot. That a boat builder with no military background could solve a problem the Navy had struggled with for decades. That ordinary workers, women in welding masks, men with high school educations, could produce weapons of war that matched or exceeded anything the enemy could field. The Higgins boat was not just a tool of war. It was a symbol of the society that built it practical, adaptable, relentless. It did not rely on brilliance or genius. It relied on competence, repeated at scale, until the cumulative effect became overwhelming. In the final accounting, wars are not won by single weapons or single men. They are won by systems, logistical, industrial, human systems, that can sustain effort over time, that can absorb losses and continue fighting, that can turn raw materials into finished products faster than the enemy can destroy them. The Higgins boat was a cog in that system, but it was an essential cog, the one that connected the production lines of Detroit and the shipyards of Norfolk to the beaches of Normandy and the Pacific atolls. Without it, the entire system would have stalled. The tanks would have sat in Britain, useless. The soldiers would have remained aboard transport ships, unable to reach the shore. The war would have dragged on, the casualties mounting, the outcome uncertain. But Higgins built the boat. The workers built 20,000 more, and the men rowed them onto beaches across 2 oceans, carrying the war forward, one landing at a time. The sun sets over the Industrial Canal now, just as it did in 1942, casting long shadows across the empty lots where Higgins's shipyards once stood. The warehouses are gone, replaced by container yards and strip malls. The river still flows, brown and slow, indifferent to the history that unfolded along its banks. But if you know where to look, if you walk along the levee at dusk and let your imagination drift, you can almost see them, rows of Higgins boats lined up along the docks, waiting to be loaded onto transports bound for distant shores. You can hear the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the shouts of workers finishing one more boat before the shift ends. And you can understand, in a way that no museum placard can convey, that this place mattered, that what was built here, simple, ugly, functional, changed the world. Because in the end, that is what war demands, not perfection, but solutions. Not elegance, but effectiveness. Not genius, but the stubborn insistence that there must be a way, and if no one else can find it, then by God, We will build it ourselves. Andrew Higgins built it. America built it. And the men who rowed those boats into hell and back carried the weight of that effort forward, one beach at a time, until the war was won and the world was free. The Higgins boat did not win the war alone. But without it, the war could not have been won at all. And that simple truth etched into plywood and steel, welded together in the swamps of Louisiana, remains the most profound testament to what a democracy at war can achieve when survival demands nothing less than everything.